For over 70 years, the world has speculated what happened in Roswell, New Mexico that night.
Yeah, whatever. I think it's time to finally clear up all this stupid Roswell shit. If you stick with me for the next 5 minutes, you'll see a lot of secrets, and know more about the subject than just about anybody else. To understand Roswell, you need to understand the end of World War II. As the Allies advanced through Europe, they started to find secret German aircraft in the facilities they were capturing. The Americans also captured German test pilots. Many of these Luftwaffe pilots were sent to the American concentration camp, POW camp for Germans, at Fort Bliss in Texas. These Luftwaffe pilots were given a deal. Their family would be given amnesty if they worked with the Americans in a group called Watson's Whizzers. At the end of the war, this group of pilots was sent throughout Europe to take the German secret aircraft that were captured and fly them back to Cherbourg, France, where they were loaded onto an aircraft carrier called the HMS Reaper and brought to New Jersey. This was an early part of Operation Paperclip, where they brought over German scientists and gave them lives here in America so they could build our military-industrial complex. Specifically, this was called Operation Lusty for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, and the naval portion of it was called Operation Seahorse. The Americans took German secret experimental aircraft, test pilots, and scientists, brought them over, and then spread them throughout the country to various military bases and test facilities. A lot of the test pilots and secret aircraft went to what became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, which figures very prominently in UFO lore. But I think the most interesting planes that made it over and then disappeared were the Horton Flying Wings. These flying wings, built by the Horton brothers starting in the 1930s, could blow the doors off anything that we had. This is a document you can go read on the CIA's archive called German High-Speed Airplanes and Design Developments from August of 1945. This document lists the specifications for a Horton HO-229, which was a jet-powered version of this aircraft, and we know that at least one functioning example of this craft was brought over during Operation Seahorse. The speed is listed at 590 miles an hour, while the fastest thing that we had was a P-51 Mustang that could top out around 450. And the ceiling, the elevation that this plane could fly, was 52,500 feet, while everything else topped out around 40,000. So basically, this jet-powered flying wing was 25% faster and higher than anything we had in the skies. This is where things get interesting and relevant to the Roswell incident. The working version of the Horton Flying Wings disappeared, but we do know that the group that they were given to study and back engineer was Northrop. See, the guy that ran Northrop, Jack Northrop, had been a fanboy of the Horton brothers since the 1930s, when he was trying to develop and back engineer his own version of the Horton Flying Wings that they had brought out years earlier. At the same time that Jack Northrop was getting his hands on some of that sweet German tech, we know that Wernher von Braun was starting up our rocketry program, which later became NASA, at White Sands in New Mexico. And we know that the German scientists and test pilots were being congregated around various facilities and military installations to keep them away from the public, and one of these clusters was White Sands. Within the White Sands Proving Grounds, there is a facility called the Northrop Strip. This airstrip was mysteriously built in the 1940s and kept off maps until the 1960s, and the backstory of it is sus as fuck. In this interesting article from the Holloman Air Force Base official website, it states that the Northrop Strip was used by Northrop Aviation in the 1940s to test military target drones. And in 1976, NASA selected the Strip as the site for its shuttle pilot training. The craziest anomaly here is that this unknown Army airfield had some of, if not the longest runways in the world. This website by an aviation historian states that the Northrop Strip wasn't even being shown on aviation sectional charts in 1961, that the earliest time it shows up is the June 1965 Roswell sectional chart, and that the airfield is noted as having a 32,000-foot-long unpaved runway. That is a 6-mile-long runway. As a point of reference, the SR-71 Blackbird spy plane that held all the altitude and speed records flew out of Beale Air Force Base off a 2.2-mile-long runway. People that are familiar with the infamous Area 51, it's often touted as having the world's longest runway, and that runway is also 6 miles long. So I'll ask you, what the hell were they flying in the 1940s that required a 6-mile-long airstrip? Oh, and it doesn't have just one airstrip, it has two. One goes north-south and the other goes east-west. Most plane crashes occur during the takeoff or landing stages of a flight, and when you see where the east-west runway from this airfield is pointed, it'll all click. As we pull out on the map of the Northrop Strip, we see that 100 miles away in a direct straight line is the location of the Roswell crash. It would make sense to me that if you were testing an experimental aircraft that went around 600 miles an hour and you took off from that airstrip and something went wrong in 10 to 15 minutes, you would crash in that general location. So let's take a look at what we know. We know that Northrop was back engineering the Horton designs. We know that he had an airstrip, a secret airstrip, that was pointed directly at Roswell and was only a hop, skip, and a jump away. We also know that there were Germans all over the area, in White Sands and at the Roswell Army Air Base in their German POW camp. And we know that those German scientists and test pilots were getting sweetheart deals to continue on the experimentation on these secret aircraft. So are there any Horton aircraft that look like what supposedly crashed at Roswell or UFOs in general? Yup. This is the Horton 10 from 1944, a triangular design with a forward cockpit, and it looks suspiciously like the later reportings of the design of the craft from Roswell. And this is Kenneth Arnold, who in 1947 reported witnessing a fleet of UFOs flying over Mount Rainier, only what he reported was not flying saucers, they were flying wings. Some of the Horton craft looked downright alien, including this Horton 13 shown here in flight. Some of these craft flew so high that the pilots had to wear an early version of a spacesuit. Now, do you think if you saw somebody dressed like this crashed in a completely alien-looking aircraft in the middle of the desert, you'd think they were Martians? And people can come out and say things about the memory metal that was supposedly found on the crash site, but memory metal like nitinol was actually developed in the 1940s by Battelle in the Air Force and Oak Ridge National Laboratories. We also shouldn't forget that the wreckage from Roswell was taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, then Wright Field in Ohio. And as I told you earlier in the video, a lot of the test pilots and scientists from Paperclip and Operation Lusty came over and were put at Wright Field. So is it kind of making sense now that this doesn't have to be an alien event, that there were human technologies and human programs going on in that exact area that could account for what happened at Roswell? I'm not saying that I don't believe in the possibility of aliens or non-human entities. I've seen some shit that I cannot explain myself. What I'm saying very specifically is that I don't believe that Roswell was an alien event. And now maybe you won't get caught up in any more propaganda.